In 1940, the United States government commissioned a psychological evaluation program that would never see the light of day. What they discovered wasn't mental illness, wasn't mass hysteria, and wasn't collective delusion. What they found was a pattern, a terrifying consistency in human behavior itself that suggested certain locations in America trigger responses we cannot explain through conventional psychology. My name is irrelevant. What matters is what I've uncovered in 40 years of forensic psychology. A behavioral mystery that connects mass evacuations, documented psychological breaks, and population-wide trauma responses across this continent. This is not superstition. This is empirical psychological data. And if you want to follow this investigation to its conclusion, subscribe to Zorivox Chronicles, because what I'm about to show you is just the beginning. Between 1935 and 1945, the Civilian Conservation Corps deployed workers to remote territories across 38 states. Standard operations, land clearing, road building, infrastructure development. But in 17% of work sites, crews exhibited identical behavioral patterns: anxiety attacks, paranoid ideation, sleep disturbances, work refusal. The official reports called it environmental stress disorder. The camp physicians called it something else entirely. I've examined the original psychiatric evaluations, the ones kept in personal medical files, not government records. Descriptions of intrusive thoughts, persistent sensation of being observed, vivid nightmares with recurring imagery, and most significantly, identical reports from men who had never met, never communicated, describing the same psychological phenomena in locations hundreds of miles apart. Grown men, psychologically stable according to pre-deployment screening, experiencing acute onset anxiety disorders within days of arrival at specific sites. The correlation is undeniable. Every high-incident location shares environmental characteristics, yes, but more importantly, they share a psychological profile. Workers at these sites exhibited what we now call place-specific trauma response, a condition where location itself becomes a trigger for severe psychological distress. But here's what disturbs me as a psychologist. These responses occur in people with no prior trauma history, no predisposition to anxiety disorders, and no shared cultural background that might explain collective belief systems. In 1940, an entire mining community in Pennsylvania experienced what medical records describe as collective nervous collapse. 17 families abandoned their homes within 48 hours. The official diagnosis: mass hysteria triggered by mine collapse fears. Except I've reviewed the psychiatric intake records from the nearest hospital. These weren't panicked evacuations. These were calculated, deliberate departures made by individuals who described overwhelming psychological compulsion to leave. Not fear, compulsion. One patient, a mine foreman with 20 years experience and no psychiatric history, told his evaluating physician, "The ground doesn't want us here. I know how that sounds, but I also know I can't stay." That's not hysteria. That's environmental psychological response to stimuli we haven't identified yet. I've documented 43 similar incidents across the Midwest and Appalachia. Each one shares characteristics: sudden onset of place-specific anxiety, sleep pattern disruption, intrusive thoughts about subsurface phenomena, and what I call departure compulsion, the overwhelming psychological need to abandon a location despite rational understanding that no immediate threat exists. The pattern suggests something in these environments is triggering deep-seated psychological responses. The question becomes, what is the stimulus? And why does it affect neurologically healthy individuals with such consistency? And before we go further, if these findings disturb you, if they make you question what you think you know about the relationship between place and mind, then you need to subscribe to Zorivox Chronicles. Hit that button now, because the psychological evidence only gets more compelling from here. As a forensic psychologist, I'm trained to identify behavioral patterns. When one person exhibits delusional thinking, we look for individual pathology. When multiple people exhibit identical delusions with no contact or shared cultural framework, we look for environmental causation. America has an environmental causation problem, and it's been replicating for over a century. In 1878, an entire village in Vermont was abandoned overnight. Population 263. Medical records from surrounding towns document the arrival of refugees describing identical psychological symptoms, persistent auditory phenomena, intrusive thoughts about subsurface activity, and what several physicians noted as rational fear without rational cause. These people weren't irrational. They were experiencing something we had no framework to understand. In 1902, railroad workers in Nevada collectively refused to continue construction. Company medical officer documented sustained psychological distress without identifiable traumatic event. 12 men, different backgrounds, different psychological profiles, all reporting the same experience. The sensation of wrongness so profound it overrode economic need, employment contracts, and social pressure to continue working. In 1919, a farming community in Kansas experienced what local physicians called an epidemic of melancholia, mass depression, livestock deaths that triggered disproportionate grief responses, families abandoning productive farmland for reasons they couldn't articulate. Medical examinations showed no physiological cause. Psychological evaluations revealed profound place-based distress. In 1934, construction workers in New Mexico experienced 3 deaths in 1 week. Standard accident investigation found no safety violations, no equipment failures, no negligence. But psychological interviews with surviving crew members revealed something fascinating: escalating anxiety in the days before each accident. Workers reporting difficulty concentrating, intrusive thoughts. A foreman's journal entry 2 days before the 3rd death reads, "The men are jumpy, can't explain it. Nothing's happened, but everyone's waiting for something to happen." That's not coincidence. That's precognitive anxiety response to environmental stimuli. I overlaid a map of America's highest prescription antidepressant and anti-anxiety medication usage by zip code, with historical records of mass evacuation events and psychological distress clusters from 1850 to 1950. 87% correlation. We're medicating responses to environmental stimuli we don't understand. We're treating the symptoms while living on top of the cause. Interstate communities built over these zones, suburban developments, major cities, all of them showing elevated baseline psychological distress that we attribute to modern life, economic pressure, social isolation. But what if it's not modern life? What if it's the land itself? I'm not an engineer. I'm a psychologist. I don't measure electromagnetic fields or geological formations. I measure human responses. And the human response to these locations is consistent, measurable, and profound. People don't want to be in these places. Not consciously, perhaps, but psychologically, neurologically, their minds are screaming to leave. Residents in these zones report phenomena I can categorize clinically: auditory hallucinations with consistent content across unrelated individuals, tactile hallucinations of observation, intrusive thoughts with recurring themes of subsurface activity, sleep architecture disruption with REM abnormalities, and persistent low-level anxiety without identifiable triggers. The house was only 10 years old, but it felt wrong, like we didn't belong there, like something else did. That's from a patient in Oregon, 2003. Clinical interview revealed no prior anxiety disorder, no trauma history, no cultural beliefs that would predispose this interpretation, just pure psychological response to place. Here's one from medical records in Ohio, 1956. Every night at 2 a.m., I wake up convinced there's something beneath the house. I'm a rational person. I know it's not logical, but the feeling is so strong I can't sleep there anymore. The attending psychiatrist noted, patient demonstrates insight into irrational nature of belief, yet reports inability to control physiological anxiety response. No evidence of delusional thinking in other areas of life. And this from a psychological evaluation in Louisiana, 1987. We were working construction, hit something 12 feet down that looked old, really old. That night, I had the first panic attack of my life. 34 years old, never had anxiety before. The attacks continued every night until we poured new foundation over it. Then they stopped, completely. Never had another one. That's not random. That's stimulus and response. I have 314 similar case files, documented, clinically evaluated, cross-referenced with location data. And here's the disturbing part. In 72% of cases, the psychological symptoms resolved completely within 6 months of leaving the location. These aren't chronic mental illnesses. These are acute, place-specific psychological responses. The land is affecting the mind. Let me show you something that changed everything for my research. I took a map of the continental United States and plotted every documented mass evacuation event where no physical disaster occurred, no flood, no fire, no environmental contamination, just people leaving. Then I overlaid psychiatric admission rates from 1850 to 1950 for acute anxiety and delusional disorders that fully resolved post-treatment. Then I added Indigenous oral histories that describe certain locations as psychologically dangerous, places where the mind goes wrong, where spirits speak too loudly, where people shouldn't build permanent structures. They knew. The original inhabitants of this continent knew exactly which areas triggered psychological distress. They didn't have our clinical terminology, but they recognized the pattern. They marked these places as spiritually dangerous because that was their framework for understanding psychological response to environmental stimuli. And we ignored every single warning because we didn't share their framework. We built anyway. And we're treating millions of people for anxiety and depression that might be environmental responses, not mental illness. If you're not subscribed to Zorivox Chronicles yet, do it now, because in upcoming episodes, I'll be showing you the specific psychological profiles of these zones, the current populations living in high-risk areas, and the clinical predictions we can make based on historical behavioral patterns. This story doesn't end in 1940. It's affecting people right now.